If you take your favorite Bible program and you enter the word anxious into the search engine and just produce a list of all the references to the word anxious in whatever translation of the Bible you have, this one's the English Standard Version, what you're going to pop up with is a long list of what increasingly looks like the person you should not be. If you just start there in the Old Testament, there's with Psalm 127, it says, "It's in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep." You know, you're not supposed to be tied up in that kind of toil and that kind of work. We're told in the Isaiah 35, "Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong and fear not," right? And then you keep on reading down through the list. You know, the anxious person is not fearful when drought comes. You've got Daniel who's anxious in Daniel 7, but it's okay. He's anxious about godly things, so we kind of let that slide. Matthew 6, Jesus tells us like a drumbeat, stop being anxious. Do not be anxious for this. Do not be anxious for that. Are you not better than the birds of the air and the lilies and so forth? Don't be anxious. Don't be anxious. Unless you're Paul, and then you can be anxious about the things of the church, you know, or the unmarried man is anxious in 1 Corinthians 7 about the things of the Lord, how to please his Lord. The married man is anxious about his wife. You probably can relate to that. You keep reading down through the list, and it's like, sometimes if you're anxious about the right thing, that's okay, but more often than not, you're anxious about all this other stuff that you shouldn't be anxious about. The most telling example is in Philippians. Paul says in Philippians 2:28, he says, in terms of being eager to send someone, "I am more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious." So Paul says, it's good that this is happening so that I can be less anxious. And then 2 chapters later says, do not be anxious about anything. Which is it? If you can't tell, and this is not a joke, I am an anxious person by trade. If it were an Olympic sport, there would be no competition, okay? We get through all this list and we're like, great. Now I don't know what to do. This morning's sermon comes by way of 3 sources. On the 2022 survey, dealing with mental health issues, as in anxiety and depression and so on, was on the list. This sermon originally started as a sermon on anxiety and depression, and at the 3-hour mark, I said, I got to make a change. So we're going to talk about the other side of that, Lord willing, one day. I've had people, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, mention this idea of, hey, I'd really like to hear about this particular topic. I'd like to hear about anxiety. And then, as I just said a moment ago, there's a very personal need to discuss these things in detail. I won't hide from any of you that I do struggle with certain things, and I don't struggle with certain things. This is one of the ones. This is one of the ones that gets me. I want to make a couple of acknowledgments before I dive right in. Number one, if you have picked up a copy of the bulletin, please don't be anxious about the fact that it's 2 pages on the inside. I put that there because there's no way possible inside of an hour I'm going to be able to say everything in my notes. I realized I gauge sermons by the number of pages, and I said, there's no hope. So I wanted to put as much in there as I could that you could look at, dwell on later. We'll be able to go through some of it, but not all of it. A couple of acknowledgments besides that. When Brother Hoagland was here, he did an excellent sermon, I believe it was Thursday night, on how to live a worry-free life. And it was one of those lessons where I left and I go, I'm so glad he came here, because that was one of the ones I needed. You'll recognize it. It's got the funny picture of a toy or some kind of in the description there. Tremendous lesson, all right? And some of the things I'm going to mention this morning are things he said, and so I want to give credit where it's due. This is another place I was able to get a lot of good information. You may be aware of Brother Art Adams. He's a gospel preacher in Plymouth, Indiana. He's a licensed therapist, master social worker. He's the executive director of a nonprofit called Leaving the Pit Behind. It's located in Indianapolis. And as their website portrays, they specifically provide clinical options for Christians in terms of counseling, in terms of therapy, even in terms of medication and those sorts of things. They are a group that deals with addiction in all of its different facets, anxiety, depression, all of the other sort of mental health things that we deal with. So much so that if we ever had an opportunity to have him come by and speak, he can have as much time as he wants because he's phenomenal. His material was extremely good, and I commend that to you as well. Here's how we're going to attempt to deal with this particular topic. I want to look first at the root of the matter. What exactly is it? I think this was something that was more helpful to me than anything else. What exactly are we talking about when Jesus says, don't be anxious? And when Paul says, I want to be less anxious, but then don't be anxious about anything. What is going on here with all this? How do we make sense of it all? How do we put it in language that I can understand and maybe it'll be helpful to someone else? Secondly, the big question on my mind is this sinful? Is it sinful to be anxious? Now let me show you the example of a perfect cycle, perfect storm. If my anxiety is sinful, then I'm going to be anxious over whether or not I'm in sin, which then means I'm in sin because I'm anxious over whether or not I'm in sin. You see where I'm going? Is it sinful to feel this way? I want to look at biblical examples of people that I believe were in those situations and think more about, is it wrong to be in that mindset? What does the Bible say about it might be the subject of the entire sermon, but we're going to look more closely at three passages, Matthew 6, Philippians, and then 1 Peter 5, at what we can glean from there in terms of helping ourselves with this. And then finally, what do we do in real life? How do we leave this room and then go out into our cars and into our homes and into our workplaces, actually trying to do better with this? What are some of the real life concrete things we can do to deal with anxiety as Christians? When you're thinking of a definition for anxiety, I provide for you two examples. The first one comes from our old trusted source, Wikipedia, or rather Oxford Dictionary by way of Google. Anxiety is described as a feeling, which is an important word. We're going to think more on that in a moment. It's a feeling of worry or nervousness or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Another alternate definition, it's a feeling of fear, dread, or uneasiness in response to a future threat, whether it's real or not. Some important things to gather just from the definition is, number one, it's a feeling, first off. It's a feeling that must then be responded to. It is centered on something happening in the future. We're typically not anxious about things that have happened in the past because they're done and over with. If I am anxious about something in my past, it's not because it's over with, it's because it might have an effect on something later, right? Did I leave the oven on at home? Well, that's over and done with, but am I going to come home to my house being burnt down, right? It has to do with the future. It is a future fear. And it's a fear of something, whether it's real or not. Parents, have you ever dealt with this with your children? You try to explain to them there's no monster under the bed. There's nothing in your closet going to eat you. Does it matter to a kid? Not really. But we go through those sorts of things too. Our minds cannot distinguish between things that are real and things that are not. With threats, we just see them as threats and then we respond to them. And anxiety is this fear of something that's going to happen in the future. It is something that, to the correct degree and in the right context, is good for you. If you're walking through the woods and you see a sign like this one that says bear in the area, I suggest being anxious is maybe a good path. Because what is it going to do? It's a fear of something that's going to happen in the future, being eaten, right? And so what might you do because of that fear? Well, your eyes might get a little wider. You might shorten your breath. Your body's going to go into that fight or flight kind of thing with the adrenaline pumping. You're going to be watchful. You're going to be listening for big berry footsteps in the woods, right? That's a healthy response. An unhealthy response would be to see the sign that says bear in the area and just run screaming into the woods, right? Maybe an overreaction. It's possible to underreact to certain fears. To just say, well, I don't care, I'm bigger than any bear, and go. See, that would not be wise. In response to something that's about to happen in your future, there is an appropriate way to deal with it. Anxiety is what brings that opportunity about. In a sense, it is a protective mechanism. However, when it's allowed to persist, there is a point in which you leave the woods and the bear is no longer there. But what if the fear continues? And it presses on us, and it leans on us, and it never really seems to go away, and it wears on us, and we're stuck in this constant, what do I do, fear, freeze, flight, one of those. When it's unresolved, it can lead to something I think the Scripture describes as worry. Brett did a good job when he was here highlighting this Greek word for us, merimnao, I believe it is. And that root word in the Greek has the idea of being distracted, of being pulled in opposite directions. Have you ever been to school, you ever been to class, and you had something terrible happen in your family, and you find that all of a sudden you just can't really listen to what's going on? That's a distractedness. That's a worry. That's something that has gotten your attention, right? I think that's the sense in which the Bible uses it in Matthew 6 and Philippians 4 and other places. Being distracted means that something comes up that threatens to take away your focus. And when we worry, we dwell on those things. It wears us out. We get to the point of exhaustion, just with this constant loop going on in our head of what's going to happen in the future. Sometimes we can think towards a solution, but sometimes there's no solution to be found, and so we're just stuck in this constant cycle of just not being able to think about other stuff. It can manifest in terms of phobias that we might have or different fears, right? A few years ago, and it wasn't anyone here, so no one has to worry. This is a bad sermon to worry in. But a few years ago, I was eating chicken at someone's house, and it just so happened they forgot to cook the middle of it. And from that point forward, I am terrified of eating uncooked chicken. Right? So much so to where my chicken needs to be the color of this microphone, right? It needs to be dark. Why? Why though? Why do I have this irrational fear of someone undercooking the chicken? Because I'm afraid of something that might happen in the future. I'm afraid of something that might happen if I'm not more careful. We can start playing the what if game. It can manifest in terms of panic attacks. We start playing the what if game. What if I left the garage door open? What if I left the candle burning at my house? On a spiritual level, what if I forgot to confess something I did a long time ago? What if I'm really not on the right side with God? What if this, what if that? It can lead us to even begin thinking things that are just plain not true. It can lead us to wrong pathways of thinking. We start to believe things that aren't really rooted in reality. It can manifest even at the disorder level. Now, disorder is an important word. Not everybody has an anxiety disorder. A disorder, clinically defined, is something that causes a significant disturbance in thinking and emotional regulation or behavior. It's not to say that every single person has a disorder, but some people do. Some people, their anxiety manifests in a very severe sense to the point of obsessive compulsiveness, or PTSD is really an anxiety based on trauma. Trauma in the past causes fear of something in the future. And there are many outlets for this. And I am not a clinician, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a patient, or I should be. But there are people far more qualified to talk about these specific areas, but these are some of the ways it can manifest. I think the important thing we need to see, first of all, is that we got to distinguish between feeling it and how we respond to it. If just feeling it's a problem, then we've got a big problem. But anxiety really gets classified as a lot of other feelings do. How we respond to it is not the same as feeling it. We get angry. How do we respond to anger? We get sad. How do we respond to sadness? We're attracted to a person. How do we respond to that attraction? Right? Anxiety falls in that category. Our fear over what will happen in the future is not the same as how we choose to respond to that fear. And so now the big question is this a sinful thing? Is it just true that I don't have enough faith? If I'm having this feeling, This feeling over something that's about to happen in the future. Is it just true that I just don't trust God enough? I haven't prayed enough? That might be true just on its own, but is my anxiety pointing me in that direction? Is it just I don't have enough faith and I need to get more faith, and as soon as I have more faith, I'll be better off, but then I'm anxious about not having more faith, so then there's that. Think about Moses. I want to go through just some examples. If you begin in Exodus 16, and you read through chapter 19, just count the number of times it says that Israel grumbled against God. You got to understand Moses' position. He's the man in the middle here. You have grumpy, unhappy, hard to deal with Israel. And because of their unhappiness and their grumbling, you've got unhappy God on the other side. Angry God who's dealing with this people that are thankless and rude to him. And then there's Moses who's caught in the middle. Moses who has to lead this group of unhappy people before a God that they have failed to make happy, and he's just torn between the two. You read Numbers, the 11th chapter. Begin there with me in verse 10. This is a tremendous passage because it shows you what this constant tension does to a person. This constant pressure, this constant stress that causes maybe an anxiety over something that's going to happen in the future. In Numbers chapter 10, in chapter 11, Moses really had it in verse 10. It says, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. You get it? Both sides are upset. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land you swore to give to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all this people? For they weep before me and they say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too great for me, or too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. How's Moses doing right now? Moses is caught between God and Israel. And when he considers the future prospect of leading this people, to carry them around like a whining baby, basically, he's filled with fear and dread of having to continue to bear that burden. And his fear and his dread and his anxiety causes him to say something that he probably wouldn't have said otherwise. Just kill me now. Anxiety can lead us to say things like that when we consider the prospect of something in the future and how awful it might be. What about Elijah? Elijah in 1 Kings 18 is a big part of a tremendous victory on the behalf of God's people. You've got the great scene on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal being defeated and Elijah slaying them and then running them off. And then there's this great, basically, affirmation that God is God and Baal is not. And beginning in 1 Kings 19, Jezebel, good old Jezebel sends a message to Elijah and she says this, verse 2. So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, to take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Elijah's future prospects were not bright. The queen of Israel just said, you're going to die by this time tomorrow. Do you suppose Elijah had a, quote, feeling of worry or nervousness or unease about an imminent event? We read further in chapter 19 and we find out that Elijah believes himself to be the only faithful Israelite left. And so what does he do? He lies down under a tree and he begs God to kill him. For, quote, I am no better than my fathers. Was Elijah really not better than his ancestors? The Elijah that just got this great victory for God on Mount Carmel and has been doing miracles. Really? What about Paul? In 2 Corinthians, I think we find several references to the sorts of struggles Paul experienced, at least on the mental side of things. In 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 8, Paul writing here says, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." Now notice here at the end of verse 10, there is a proper response, I think, to this fear. He responded by realizing, God brought this on us so that we could rely on Him and not ourselves. That's a great thing to do. But that also means he had the fear beforehand. It means he despaired of life. And he felt like he was under a death sentence. What about chapter 7 and verse 5 from 2 Corinthians? Chapter 7 and verse 5, Paul writing again says, "For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn." And notice the next phrase. "Fighting without and fear within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus." Yeah, Paul dealt with fighting and beatings and so on the outside, but he also dealt with a lot of stuff on the inside. He describes the fear that he has had and describes God as a God who comforts the downcast. If God comforts the downcast, then doesn't that mean Paul was downcast? In 11 and verse 28, probably the most clear example of this. In 11 and verse 28, verse 24, he begins by describing the beatings and the so on that he had been receiving, beaten with rods and stoned and shipwrecked and on journeys and in danger from Gentiles and so on. Verse 28, he says this, 2 Corinthians 11:28, "And, apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches." The daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. In your Bible, it might say care or concern or some other similar word. The word Paul uses here for anxiety is the same one Jesus uses in Matthew 7, merimna or merimnao. Same one. What about Jesus? In Luke 12 and verse 50, in reference to the events that were about to come true in his life, in reference to the crucifixion and the trials and so on, Jesus says in Luke 12 and verse 50, "I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished." Now, the word here Jesus uses for distress is not anxiety, it's the word syneko. It means to be held together or to be pressed or to be compressed. We would say that Jesus is under a lot of pressure, just like Paul was under a lot of pressure from his anxiety for the churches. He says he has something he must undergo, and he's under an incredible amount of pressure until it's accomplished. Did Jesus ever experience fear or unease or dread at a future event? You suppose Jesus was anxious in Matthew 4 when he's tempted for 40 days and then Satan shows up? How about in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4 when after he preaches his message, they drag him to a cliff outside the town and threaten to throw him off of it? What about in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus begged God to take the cup away from him, that imminent event, and prayed so intensely he started sweating through his pores? You think he was having a worry or a fear or a dread of something that was about to happen? Of course he was. Was Jesus in sin for feeling that way? Are all these men sinners in need of repentance because they have anxiety? No. No, they're not. Experiencing these feelings of anxiety is not sinful. How one responds to those feelings could be. And that's the way Jesus describes it in Matthew 6. When we go to Matthew 6, we look more closely at the text. Matthew 6, beginning there in verse 25. It's probably a bit small on the screen, so you'll have to turn along with me. Matthew 6, beginning there in verse 25. in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, notice the way Jesus describes their anxiety. It says, Matthew 6:25, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" Stop for a second. Why were they not to be anxious over their food and their clothing? Things that they needed, things that I'm sure they were concerned about whether they would have those things in the future. Why does Jesus tell them, "Do not need to be concerned over this"? Anxiety causes us to begin thinking things that are not true. It causes us to go in directions that are not helpful. It causes us to believe things that are not true. Jesus drags them back into reality with one line. He says, "Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing?" What is he saying? He's saying, look, God's already given you a body and a life to live it in, or a life that fills it. Do you really think He's not going to give you the stuff you need to provide for that life and that body? What does our anxiety do? It causes us to doubt. It causes us to be afraid. It causes us to wonder, are we really going to have what we need? And Jesus says, yeah, you are. Why? Because He's already given you a life and a body to live. God's gifts show us that He's more than willing to take care of us. Has He not already proven Himself just with the birds? And you're of more value than they are? We're not to respond to our feelings of anxiety with worry and faithlessness. This was the way Israel responded to their anxiety. They began to be afraid over whether or not they would be fed. Did they turn to God in faith? No. They started grumbling and wanting to go back to Egypt. Moses is on Mount Sinai for a period of time. Did they respond with faith in God? No. They said, "Aaron, build us something we can worship." We don't know what happened to Moses. Right? Having the fear of something that's about to happen in the future that fear must be responded to appropriately. And so Jesus is telling us in Matthew 6, there's a wrong way to respond to it, and that's with worry. Israel responded to their worries by turning away from God. Jesus tells us instead, turn towards Him. They were to respond to their anxieties by doing something they could accomplish. Seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. God's in charge of handling whether or not you're provided for, and He is eminently faithful at doing that. So in response to that, Jesus tells us, seek first the kingdom. Seek first His righteousness. You can affect your relationship with God. You can't, by any amount of worry, provide for yourself or even change one hair of your head from white to black. It's humbling to be told that our entire mental energy cannot accomplish very much, isn't it? Read verse 27 again. Jesus asks us another question. He declares another fact. Which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? Which one of those people there, which one of us gathered here today, can just by sheer will say, you know what, I know I'm supposed to die right now, but I don't have to for another few minutes? It's humbling to be told that our entire mental capacity has a ceiling that's not very high, or in terms of what it can accomplish. In Philippians, the 4th chapter, when Paul, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, describes to us, be anxious for nothing, tells us the alternative. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Prayer is a large part of the solution to anxiety. But it's not the prayer sometimes we teach small children. It's not the formed prayer. It's not even the recited prayer that Paul is talking about. Paul gives us some important details about the prayer that helps us with our anxiety. Number one, in everything. Pray about everything. Even the little stuff. If you feel the need to pray for your dog, do it. If you need to pray about the weather, do it. If you need to pray about something that seems completely insignificant and matters nothing, do it. Why? Because our brains cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a perceived one. We just see something as a threat. Pray for it. Pray for the big things. Stop praying with eyedroppers and start praying with buckets. Pray with trucks if you have to. We're told to make entreaties to God by prayer and supplication, right? Beg God if you have to. Plead with God. Do it more than once. Do it every few minutes if necessary. Pray and pray hard. Pray diligently. None of us, I don't think, have prayed to the point of sweating blood yet. We'll be fine. Pray more intensely than we ever have before. And while you're doing that, begin to thank God for all of His blessings. Appreciate in prayer the gifts and blessings for us, no matter how big, no matter how little. You want to help your anxiety over whether or not you're going to have something tomorrow? Start counting all the stuff God gave you today and realize He's as faithful today as He was yesterday. God promises an inexplicable peace to those who trust in Him. Why can't it be explained? Because sometimes we don't know how God's going to provide for us. We don't know how God's going to solve the problem. We don't know the big plan. We don't get it. So we trust Him. We know He's going to take care of things. It serves as a guardian to our heart and our mind. There's one other aspect of this that really I never noticed before preparing for this. This is what Peter mentions in 1 Peter chapter 5. In the second half of verse 5, in 1 Peter 5, Peter says this: "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you." Too often, this passage gets split between two different sermons. There's the sermon on you don't need to think as highly of yourself as you should, the humility, the pride sermon. And so you read the first part of that. You need to be clothed with humility. You need to humble yourselves under God's hand, so on. And then when we get to talking about being anxious and being worried and those kinds of things, that's when we read the second half, or the second, maybe bottom third of this. Cast your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. Peter writes them all together. Why? Usually, those that are not humble enough to realize their own limitations are not willing to cast their cares upon God. Just think about it. Just a little more effort, I can solve the problem. If I just think a little more, if I just work a little harder, if I just stay up a little bit longer, a solution will come to mind and I can solve my problem and everything will be fine. That type of person and that type of thinking is not going about casting their anxieties on God. They're carrying as many as they can hold. It's the person who's willing to say, I am weak, I am frail, sometimes I am stupid, often I am faithless. That type of person is usually the one willing to say to God, this is who I am today. I can't deal with it. I need you to deal with it. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that at the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on Him, for He cares for you. The two go together. All I can accomplish is my best, and often that's not nearly good enough. And so I have to tell God, this is yours. You have to carry it. In Psalm 27 verse 14, we're told, wait for the Lord, be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Waiting in the Old Testament is not, twiddling your thumbs. It's the idea that God will deliver. God will save. He will provide. But if we try to step in and speed up the process, if we try to look for an alternate solution, it doesn't work. Waiting on God is built on the premise that God is faithful, and whether or not I will choose to trust in His faithfulness. How do I go about actually doing that? How do I wait on God when I'm feeling anxious? Well, first of all, we got to go back to the basics and remember that you and I are people. We are human beings. We are not deity. We require such things as air and food and water and sleep and activity to be able to do our best. One thing Art brings out in his presentations is that what happens when we get anxious is we get tense. We stop breathing as well as we should. We clench, we tense up because we're ready to fight off some fear. And some of us, like me, we just live that way all the time, just balled up all the time, not breathing the way we should. In 1 Kings 19, when Elijah has his episode, he lays down under the broom tree and says, I'm ready to die. God doesn't immediately get him up and send him to Sinai. Elijah needed two things before he could move forward, and that was food and a nap. He got up the next morning ready to go, and the angel tells him, you're not ready yet. Eat and sleep some more. Now, granted, he had a 40-day walk to Mount Sinai to get ready for, but the point still remains. Elijah needed to rest, and he needed something to eat. When he got to Sinai, his problem wasn't any different, was it? When he gets to Mount Sinai, he still believes he's the only Israelite left. He still thinks he's not worthy of the cause, but he's no longer telling God, I'm ready to die. He gets to Mount Sinai and he has a chance to talk with God. He doesn't tell God then, I'm no better than my fathers. Elijah's in a better state because he was taken care of. We're made of flesh, and that flesh has limitations and requirements. Feed and water your body properly. Give it some rest. Get it up, move it around. Back before I was here, back in Mississippi, I found that just to keep my sanity, every now and again in my office, I had to get up and walk around the church building. It wasn't because I needed exercise, it was because I was going crazy with just endless cycling worry over things. If you drive by the building here in Jamestown sometimes during the week, you're liable to see this crazy preacher walking around in the parking lot. It's not because I'm trying to get a workout. If we take care of ourselves, what we'll realize is that our anxiety is probably still going to be there, but we're going to be in a better state to address it if we're taking care of ourselves. Secondly, we got to learn to pray the way Hannah prayed. You remember Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1? Hannah, who couldn't have children. And worse, she was in a marriage where there was another wife present, which was something that happened then, and the other wife was able to have children, and the other wife afflicted her day after day after day. Do you don't think Hannah was under some anxiety? You know, the type of anxiety when you try to have children for year after year after year, and you can't. It's no wonder that in 1 Samuel chapter 1, she's so tore up that when she comes to pray, she can't even make a sound. She's praying, she's deep in distress. Eli goes so far as to believe she is drunk. She says something just heartbreaking. She says in verse 16, do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. She came before God with her bucket that day and poured it all out before him. I think of Hezekiah in 2 Kings 19. Hezekiah gets a letter from the Rabshakeh, which was a general of King Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. And it's this letter threatening basically to end everything. Hezekiah does something really weird. He takes the letter and he goes into the temple. And rather than just read the letter out loud, he starts spreading the letter out all around so that God can see what it says on the letter. And then as a part of his prayer, Hezekiah says, look at the things that have been written. Now, did God need to read Hezekiah's letter? No. But for some reason or another, Hezekiah said, I need to go in the temple and I need to just lay it out before God. Maybe that's what we need to do. If speaking the prayer is too difficult, put it on paper. God knows the thought and our intent of our heart. We have a real need to lay these things out before God because we can't carry them anymore. Speaking of things we can't carry, we've got to learn to manage the feed. A lot of our anxiety comes from natural sources. A lot of it we bring on ourselves. A lot of it comes from our social media feeds, where we get this great digital funnel of all the terrible things happening on earth in the palm of our hand. If we take 10% of all the bad things that happen on the earth and think about them and dwell on them, it's no wonder I'm in the fix that I'm in. In Matthew 6 and verse 34, Jesus says, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." In that phrase, we find out we are limited. There's just so much we can handle. That Jesus says, don't even worry about tomorrow because, for one, you can't deal with it, and for two, you have enough to deal with today. We've got to learn to manage the feed, to cut off the negativity as much as we can, to eliminate what Art calls the stinking thinking, to talk to people about how we're thinking. I can't tell you the number of times I've relayed my anxiety to Maya, and she has this real knack for talking me down out of the tree and putting me back in a proper frame of mind where I start thinking stuff that doesn't make any sense. Talk to people. Stop believing that your thoughts are on par with God's thoughts. We think that if we're worried about something just a little while longer, we'll come up with a solution. God's thoughts are the reason why we exist. He spoke His thoughts into existence, and ours just don't compare. There was a device released recently on the news that claimed to be able to turn stress into electricity. And you're just thinking, I got it now. We are all powerful now. Why? Because we're just loaded with stress. This is not us. Stress doesn't empower us, it kills us. Why? Because the hamster can only run for so long on the wheel before it just keels over, it dies. We're limited. And we have to stop believing that our thoughts are on par with God's. Sometimes the most important thing I need to tell myself is while I'm feeling anxious that I am not God. And He holds tomorrow just the same way as He holds today. Finally, we got to learn to seek and accept help. Feeling anxious is not sinful. So going to a professional to deal with this is not sinful either. Is it sinful to have cancer? Of course not. Do we go to people to help us with our cancer? Yes, many people. Why not also with our mental state? That help might involve counseling. It might involve therapy. It might involve medications. I'm not a doctor. It might come from our elders. It might come from our spouses. It might come from brethren like Brother Adams, people who are incredibly qualified to do that. I have friends and family who've spent time talking with therapists, some of which you take medication. That's perfectly fine. The same blood that runs through your other organs runs through your mind. It runs through your brain. Maybe there's something wrong there. Be willing to get the help and accept the help. Don't believe that I can just be faithful enough. You can be faithful and still feel anxious. If help is needed, accept it. Seek it out. Finally, this morning, I appreciate your great patience. Maybe you're anxious about sin. You're not the first one to be anxious about sin, by the way. David was anxious over his sin often. Anxiety is a fear of something that's going to happen in the future. And anxiety over sin is a real thing because there is an event coming that we all have to reckon with. There is a meeting between ourselves and our Creator. A meeting in which we will stand before Him and give an account for the things we've done in the body, whether good or evil. There's a time coming when we will meet the Lord, and we understand the Lord and sin do not exactly go well together. David was anxious over his sin, and so he took the appropriate response in his time to confess it before the Lord. If you're anxious about the sin in your life, that's completely justified. I submit to you that the Jews in Acts 2 were anxious about what they had done too. They had murdered the Messiah. And when Peter tells them that they've murdered the Messiah, they're all of a sudden worried about a future event, correct? And so they ask him, what do we do? Peter tells them the way he can deal, or they can deal with their anxiety over sin. If you're here this morning and you have not become a Christian, you have every right to be anxious over the sin in your life. The question is, what will you do about it? Will you continue to let the hamster go around the wheel? Continue to try to find some way around it? Continue to try to suppress that urge you know you have to deal with your sin? There's a phrase that comes from battle. It's something along the lines of, don't run from conflict, you're only going to die tired. Don't run from your sin. It's only going to catch up to you, and you're not going to be in a state to be able to deal with it when that happens. You can address your sin today. You can leave this building having never the need to be anxious about what you've done ever again. Can you imagine the type of sleep you're going to get? When you know, when you close your eyes, that the Lord has paid for my sacrifice, or the Lord, through his sacrifice, has paid for my sin. That's something special. The question is whether or not you'll take the prescription Peter's given to repent, confess that Jesus is the Christ, to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sin. No, it's not earned. It is absolutely a gift given. But it's one that if you accept it, you'll be free of that. And then we can go on living our rest of our lives in faith toward God. If we can help you this morning, whether to take Peter's prescription, obey the gospel, or to return to that life, to confess your sin before God and beg his forgiveness, we want to help you with that as well. If we can do that this morning, if you'll come to the front during the song we're about to sing, we'll do just that. Let's stand and let's sing. If there's a need, I invite you to come.